Let me add my thanks to the organizers. This is my first time at one of these, and it's been absolutely splendid. And also thanks for the opportunity to comment on this very interesting paper, very challenging paper. And I'd like to say a few nice things about it before I express my reservations. And first of all, Tom shows, I think, a very clear understanding of what originalism is. As far as I can tell, there's no caricature in his piece. It's a very accurate, straight, perceptive description of both the practice and the normative grounds for originalism, and that, I think, is really quite admirable to take on a theory at its best without caricature is a model of what scholarly discussion should look like, and is all too rare. And so in that sense, I think it's an outstanding paper. And also, I think that there's really very little to disagree with at a granular level in this paper. Virtually every paragraph is correct in its historical assertions and quite sensible in where it leads us. And so the question I ask myself when I come to the end is, why am I not convinced? Why does it leave me essentially where I was before? And I try to put my finger on this, and this is what I come up with. That so the paper professes agnosticism on the question of whether, as a formalist matter, the 14th Amendment was legitimate or not. You see this at pages 2 to 3. You see this again at page 43 of the paper. It professes agnosticism. Maybe it was legitimate, maybe it was not. And this, I think, is the problem. I don't think that works. Because if the 14th Amendment was not legitimate, if it was just an illegitimate power play, well, of course, interpretation according to the original meaning will be imposing illegitimate rules upon the American people. Originalism is not a cure for departures from democratic legitimacy or violations of the supermajoritarian requirements of Article 5. All originalists can do is to ensure that current day law puts into effect the actual rules adopted by whomever had authority to enact them. And if we don't approve of who had authority to enact them, if we think that they were usurpers, then necessarily it's going to follow that that originalism is an unattractive way of interpreting those particular provisions, because the provisions themselves were illegitimate. If the amendment was adopted without the support of the people, then it can obtain no defense on the basis of popular sovereignty. If it was adopted by a small clique of Republican office holders and not by a supermajoritarian process of consideration, then it gains no support from a sort of from a McGinnis-Rappaportian supermajoritarian wisdom. All that seems to me right, but that isn't the paper's point. And if it were the paper's point, I don't think it would be much of a contribution. It would be simply another way of making the point that Bruce Ackerman made many years ago, namely that we have a portion of our Constitution that can't be defended in terms of constitutional legalism. The paper professes agnosticism, though, which is to say that maybe the 14th Amendment was legitimate. He takes no position on it, which I take it means that it is possible that the 14th Amendment was legitimate. And he refers to John Harrison's, he calls it masterful article, in which Harrison does put forward a number of plausible theories for why the 14th Amendment might have been legitimately adopted as a formalist matter. And it seems to me, therefore, that if we want to evaluate the question of originalist interpretation of the 14th Amendment, it has to be done on the basis of the premises under which that amendment might be legitimate. And so what we need to do is look at the possible bases under which the amendment might be legitimate and ask whether they invite or encourage or are congenial to originalist interpretation. And in my discussion of this, I'm going to be relying very heavily on Harrison's article. So there are two basic approaches to how the 14th Amendment might be legitimate. One of them has to do with excluding the southern states from the denominator. That is, for 2/3 of the Congress, 3/4 of the state legislatures in ratification, that if you exclude the southern states for one reason or another from the denominator, then the amendment is properly passed by the rest of the country. And then the alternative theory is that the southern states are included in the denominator, but they properly ratified under one theory or another, and thus can properly be included in the numerator as well as the denominator. And under either of these theories, the 14th Amendment is legitimately adopted. So let's begin with the exclude them from the denominator theory first. There's several different versions of this. Gerard can correct me if I'm wrong, but following Harrison, Bingham took the position that although the states remain part of the Union, they were out of relation with the Union because of the illegitimacy of their governments. So a distinction between the governments of the states and the states themselves. But Bingham took the position that while that was so, while their governments were out of relation with the Union, that they could not be consulted, they were not entitled to be consulted on constitutional change or any other legal matter, and that the fact that they chose to do that to themselves did not take away from the remaining states their right to be able to exercise constitutional authority under the Constitution, and especially under Article 5. A slight variant on that is to say that the governments of the southern states were unrepublican in form and thus not legitimate. Akhil Amar has been plumping that particular variant on the theory of late. Seems to me that if under either of those theories, that originalism works perfectly well, because what we have is a rump republic. That is to say, a working, democratically legitimate republic, to be sure, without the participation of southern states, but they're not functioning as part of the Union at the time. And as to the rest of it, popular sovereignty holds sway, supermajoritarianism holds sway, and there is no reason why originalist interpretation would not work. And there's even a good deal in terms of the supermajoritarian compromise and working together sort of theory. There's actually quite a lot of that goes on. It's just all among factions within the Republican Party. But the moderate faction and the radical faction did not agree on many things, and the 14th Amendment was very much a product of deliberation, change, and compromise, which are the hallmarks of the supermajoritarian wisdom that McGinnis and Rappaport point to. So if we take one of these family of theories having to do with excluding the southern states from the denominator, I think originalism has no difficulty at all. Well, what about the alternative theories, that the southern states remain part of the denominator, and therefore we have to count these questionable ratifications as legitimate? Why might they be legitimate? Well, first of all, Harrison points out that it is not at all unlikely that these governments would have ratified the 14th Amendment even in the absence of the provision of the Military Reconstruction Acts that required the ratification as a condition for readmission to the Congress. After all, these governments were set up excluding the Loyalist citizens of the South, including black suffrage. These were the carpetbagger and scalawag governments that were in fact dominated by capital R Republicans. They believed in the 14th Amendment. Their power depended upon the principles of the 14th Amendment. They may very well have ratified anyway. And so the legitimacy here really depends upon the question of whether it was legitimate to have any kind of reconstruction based upon exclusion of insurrectionaries and inclusion of black voters, and I don't see why not. It seems to me not a stretch to say that those governments are legitimate. What about? But what if we don't look at it that way? We think that in fact the ratification was coerced. Well, why might the coercion itself be legitimate? Harrison offers 3 different versions of this, but it doesn't really matter which one you accept. The point is that the Southern states were offered a deal and they took it. What does that mean that the 14th Amendment means? Well, whatever you think, sir. Right? They were not ratifying it because of any particular meaning. They were simply ratifying it because that was what was presented to them as the price of restoration of their status within the Union. And so the question for us now is, should we enforce a bargain of that sort according to its terms? Well, my view on this is that it was not only legitimate, but normatively desirable to allow the Southern states to re-enter the Union pacifically and on the basis of accepting the terms of the 14th Amendment. And if that's so, I do not understand why interpreters today would flinch from enforcing the terms of the 14th Amendment as they were understood by everyone at the time. And it seems to me that if this chain of events makes us uneasy, that this really reflects doubts about the legitimacy of the 14th Amendment itself, and that's a problem for political theory, perhaps. It may be a problem for constitutional theory more generally, but it isn't a problem for an interpretive theory, which has to do with meaning. Again, I think Ackerman makes points that we should be very concerned about, but I don't think that it presents a particular problem for the theory of interpretation. Because again, originalism is not intended or understood as a cure for any of the defects that may exist in the process. That what it does, it's a technique for preserving, perpetuating, and enforcing the foundational principles of the regime, whatever it is. Now, if we have a regime which is essentially based upon democratic legitimacy, then those of us who believe in democratic legitimacy as the sine qua non of supporting a regime are going to like originalism. If we have a regime which is sometimes democratically legitimate, sometimes not, flawed in various ways, but sort of good enough for government work, same answer, right? If we have a regime that is evil to its core, then we should be anti-originalists and use anti-originalist interpretation as a means for subverting the foundational principles of the evil regime. Thank you.